The moment I realized somebody had turned my loading dock into their personal free parking lot. One of my delivery trucks was sitting sideways in traffic with its hazard lights flashing, a driver yelling out his window, and a woman across the street calmly sipping wine like none of it had anything to do with her. That should have been my first clue that being polite wasn't going to solve this problem. Looking back now, it's almost funny. Almost. My name is Ryan Mercer, and I own a small wholesale supply company in a town called Ashford Ridge, a place that's just big enough to have traffic problems and just small enough for everybody to think the rules don't apply to them. About 8 years ago, I bought an old brick warehouse near the industrial side of town. The building had history. Back in the 70s, it stored agricultural equipment, then auto parts, then sat empty for years before I got my hands on it. It wasn't glamorous, but it was solid. Thick walls, high ceilings, and most importantly, a loading dock that allowed trucks to move inventory in and out efficiently. That's the thing people don't understand about businesses like mine. We don't sell fancy products. We don't have customers walking through a showroom. Everything depends on logistics. If trucks can't get to the dock, everything starts falling apart. Orders get delayed. Drivers get frustrated. Employees stand around waiting. Customers call asking where their shipments are. One blocked loading zone can create a chain reaction that lasts all day. For years, none of that was a problem. We had a simple system. The loading lane beside the warehouse was painted bright yellow. Large steel signs were mounted at both ends. Loading zone. No parking. The signs weren't small either. You could probably read them from the moon. Truck drivers respected them. Local businesses respected them. Nobody questioned them. Then everything changed when a new restaurant opened across the street. The place was called Copper and Vine. Upscale casual dining, exposed brick walls, craft cocktails, reclaimed wood tables, the kind of place where every menu item came with a paragraph explaining where the ingredients grew up. Within a week, the restaurant was packed every evening. At first, I was happy for them. An empty building had become a successful business. That's usually good for the neighborhood. But then their parking lot started filling up. And when their parking lot filled up, their customers started looking elsewhere. Unfortunately, my loading lane apparently looked convenient. The first incident seemed harmless. One evening, a silver sedan pulled into the loading zone. I noticed it while reviewing invoices in my office. A freight truck arrived about 10 minutes later and couldn't access the dock. The driver, a guy named Carl who'd been hauling deliveries for years, called me immediately. "Ryan, you got somebody parked right in front of your dock." I walked outside and sure enough, there it was. Sitting directly beneath the giant "No Parking" sign like it had been placed there as part of a practical joke. We waited. 5 minutes became 10. 10 became 15. Carl leaned against his truck looking annoyed while traffic slowly backed up behind him. Finally, a woman walked across the street carrying a takeout bag. She unlocked the car, climbed inside, and drove away without even glancing at us. No apology. No embarrassment. Nothing. Carl looked at me and laughed. Guess she figured the sign was decorative. I laughed too. At the time, it seemed like a one-off situation. It wasn't. Over the next several days, it kept happening. Different vehicles. Same story. Somebody would pull into the loading lane, park directly under the signs, then disappear into Copper and Vine for dinner. Every time it happened, my drivers had to improvise. Some circled the block. Some waited. Some called me angry. My warehouse manager, Luis, started keeping track. One afternoon, he walked into my office carrying a clipboard and said, "You know, we've lost almost 3 hours this week just waiting on parked cars." 3 hours. That got my attention. Lost time means lost money. Lost money means problems. Still, I didn't want conflict. Maybe people genuinely didn't realize they were causing issues. Maybe they assumed loading zones only mattered during business hours. Maybe they thought they were helping themselves without hurting anyone else. So I decided to handle it like an adult. One evening, I crossed the street and introduced myself to the restaurant manager, a guy named Trevor. Nice enough guy. Professional. Friendly. I explained what was happening. He listened carefully and nodded. "Yeah, that's definitely not okay," he said. "I'll remind customers not to park there." I thanked him. He thanked me. We shook hands. For 2 glorious days, the lane stayed clear. Then Friday night arrived, and everything got worse. Friday evening started like any other busy night. Deliveries were running a little behind. My crew was trying to finish several outgoing orders before closing, and I remember thinking maybe the conversation with Trevor had actually solved the problem. Then Luis called me from outside. The tone of his voice told me everything before I even walked to the window. "You're gonna want to see this." I stepped outside and honestly couldn't believe what I was looking at. Not one car. Not two. 4 vehicles were lined up along the loading lane, bumper to bumper, completely blocking access to the dock. Across the street, Copper and Vine was packed. Every table looked occupied. People stood near the entrance waiting for seats. Meanwhile, one of our freight trucks sat halfway into the road with its hazards flashing while impatient drivers squeezed around it. The entire scene looked ridiculous. Carl climbed out of his cab and shook his head. "This ain't a loading zone anymore," he said. "Looks like restaurant overflow parking." That comment stuck with me because he wasn't wrong. Somewhere along the way, people had stopped seeing private property and started seeing free convenience. The worst part wasn't even the inconvenience. It was the attitude. Every time a vehicle owner returned, they acted like we were the problem. One guy actually looked at the truck waiting behind his SUV and said, "Relax, man. I was only gone 20 minutes. Only 20 minutes." As if 20 minutes meant nothing. As if dozens of delayed shipments, employees standing idle, and delivery schedules falling apart somehow didn't count because his dinner reservation mattered more. That night, I sat alone in my office long after everyone left. Through the window, I could see the empty loading lane again, and I found myself staring at those yellow signs. They hadn't changed. The rules hadn't changed. The only thing that had changed was people's willingness to ignore them. That's when a thought hit me. The signs weren't failing. Enforcement was failing. People ignore rules all the time when there are no consequences. The next morning, I started making phone calls. First, I contacted the city to confirm property boundaries and regulations. Then I reviewed local parking ordinances. Finally, I spoke with a towing company that specialized in commercial properties. The owner, a gray-haired guy named Frank, listened patiently while I explained everything. When I finished, he laughed softly. "Ryan, let me guess. New restaurant nearby. How'd you know?" "Because I get 3 calls a month that start exactly the same way." Frank explained that because the loading lane sat entirely on private property, was clearly marked, and displayed visible no parking signage, unauthorized vehicles could legally be removed. He offered something called a standing authorization agreement. Basically, if one of his drivers saw a vehicle parked illegally in the designated loading area, they could tow immediately without waiting for me to approve each individual removal. I remember hesitating for a moment, not because I doubted the legality, because I knew what would happen next. Once towing started, people were going to get angry. Some would blame me. Some would blame the restaurant. Some would insist they were victims. But then I thought about every delayed truck, every wasted hour, every ignored warning, and I signed the paperwork. Monday came. Nothing happened. Tuesday came. Still clear. For a second, I wondered if the problem had somehow solved itself. Then Wednesday evening arrived. Around 6 o'clock, a little blue hatchback pulled into the loading lane. I happened to be standing near the warehouse entrance when it happened. The driver, a young guy wearing a sports jersey, actually looked directly at the sign before parking. He tilted his head, read it, shrugged, locked his car, and walked toward Copper and Vine. I remember laughing because the entire decision-making process took maybe 3 seconds. Read the rule. Ignore the rule. Proceed with dinner. 15 minutes later, Frank's tow truck rolled around the corner. The driver got out, checked the signs, verified the location, hooked up the hatchback, and drove away. Total time, maybe 4 minutes. Efficient. Professional. Completely legal. About an hour later, I was finishing paperwork when I heard shouting outside. Curious, I stepped to the front window. The young man had returned. He was standing exactly where his car had been parked, spinning in circles like somebody had erased part of reality. I watched him pull out his phone, call someone, pace around, then finally noticed the towing notice attached to the sign. His shoulders dropped immediately. Even from across the street, I could tell he'd figured it out. The next morning, Frank called me. "Your guy picked up his car. How'd that go?" Frank laughed. "About the same as they always do." Apparently, the towing fee, storage fee, and rideshare trip to the impound yard turned what was supposed to be a pleasant dinner into a very expensive evening. I wish I could tell you that was the end of it. It wasn't. 2 days later, another vehicle got towed. Then another. Then another. Each case followed almost the exact same pattern. Driver parks. Driver ignores signs. Driver enjoys dinner. Driver returns to discover transportation has mysteriously vanished. What fascinated me wasn't the towing itself. It was how differently people reacted afterward. Some accepted responsibility immediately. One woman walked over to the warehouse and actually apologized. She said, "Honestly, I thought the sign was there for daytime deliveries only. That's my mistake." I respected that. She made an assumption, paid the price, and moved on. Others weren't so reasonable. One man stormed into my warehouse demanding answers. "You had my truck stolen." "No," I said calmly. "A licensed towing company removed your truck from private property. You could have warned me." I pointed toward the giant yellow sign visible through the window. That was the warning. He stared at me for several seconds before realizing there wasn't really an argument left to make. Then came the incident that changed everything. It happened on a Saturday evening during the restaurant's busiest rush. A black luxury SUV pulled into the loading lane and parked directly in front of the largest sign. Not beside it. Not near it. Directly in front of it. The driver climbed out wearing an expensive suit and immediately caught my attention because he looked around first. He knew exactly what he was doing. I stepped outside and called toward him. "Sir, that's a loading zone." He stopped walking and turned around. "I'll only be a few minutes." "That's what everybody says." He smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile people use when they're convinced rules don't apply to them. "Then I guess I'll take my chances." He walked away. Luis had witnessed the entire exchange. Did he really just say that? I nodded. Yep. 20 minutes later, a tow truck arrived. 40 minutes after that, the man returned. I was standing outside when he realized his SUV was gone. The expression on his face changed so fast, it almost looked painful. First confusion, then disbelief, then outrage. He marched straight toward me. "Where's my vehicle?" "Probably heading toward the impound yard by now." "You had it towed." "No," I said. "You had it towed. I just gave you a chance not to." For a moment, I honestly thought he was going to explode. Instead, he pointed at the restaurant and shouted. Their parking lot was full. And my loading dock isn't a parking lot. He stood there speechless. Eventually, he left to retrieve his SUV. What he didn't realize was that dozens of restaurant customers had witnessed the entire scene. People talk. They always do. By the following week, something interesting started happening. Cars would approach the loading lane, slow down, then continue driving. Drivers were warning each other. Friends were sharing stories. Employees at nearby businesses were discussing the mysterious disappearance of vehicles parked beside my warehouse. The reputation spread faster than any sign ever could. Suddenly, the loading lane wasn't convenient anymore. It was dangerous territory for anyone unwilling to read. And as the number of violations dropped, I realized we were approaching the moment I'd been hoping for from the very beginning. Not revenge. Not punishment. Compliance. But one final conversation was about to put everything into perspective in a way I never expected. About 2 weeks after the towing started, I was locking up the warehouse one evening when I saw Trevor, the restaurant manager, walking across the street toward me. The funny thing was, when this whole mess began, I had quietly blamed him for a lot of it. Not because he told people to park in my loading zone, but because his business had created the problem. Looking back, that wasn't entirely fair. He looked tired when he reached me, the kind of tired that comes from dealing with the same complaint over and over again. "Mind if we talk?" he asked. I nodded, and we stood beside the loading lane, staring at the same yellow signs that had somehow become the most controversial landmarks in town. Trevor laughed first. "You know, customers keep complaining to me about their cars getting towed." I figured. "Want to know the weird part?" "Sure." "Every single one of them admits they saw the signs." That made me laugh harder than it probably should have. Trevor shook his head. "I put notices on our front door. We mention it to people during busy nights. We even added reminders on social media. They still park there." "Not anymore." He looked down the lane. Empty. Completely empty. For the first time in months, there were no random sedans, no SUVs, no delivery delays, no frustrated truck drivers. Just a loading zone doing exactly what it was designed to do. "No," he admitted. "Not anymore." We stood there for a moment, and honestly, that was the moment I realized the entire situation had never really been about parking. It was about consequences. Human nature is funny. Most people don't intentionally break rules because they're evil. They break rules because they convince themselves they're the exception. They'll only be there for a minute. Nobody will notice. It won't affect anyone. The problem is that when hundreds of people tell themselves the same story, those little exceptions become someone else's daily headache. For me, that headache had been missed schedules, delayed deliveries, frustrated employees, and unnecessary stress. For the restaurant, it had become angry customers demanding sympathy after ignoring obvious warnings. A few days later, Luis walked into my office carrying the latest delivery reports. "You noticed something?" he asked. I looked through the numbers. Every shipment had arrived on schedule. Every truck had unloaded without delays. Productivity was back where it had been before the restaurant ever opened. Maybe even better. "Looks good," I said. "Looks expensive," he replied with a grin. For the people who didn't read signs. Word had spread so thoroughly by then that the loading lane developed a reputation all its own. New visitors would start pulling in. Then somebody else in the car would point at the signs and say something like, "Don't park there. That's the place that tows everybody." I heard that exact sentence more than once. What years of paint, metal signs, and polite requests couldn't accomplish had been achieved by a handful of towing invoices. The irony wasn't lost on me. One afternoon, Carl stopped by after a delivery and pointed toward the empty lane. "Kinda peaceful now." "Yeah. You miss the excitement?" I laughed. Not even a little. And I meant it. Contrary to what some people assumed, I never enjoyed towing anyone. There was no satisfaction in costing strangers money. No thrill in ruining somebody's dinner plans. If anything, the whole experience reinforced something I'd learned years earlier in business. Most conflicts can be avoided when people respect boundaries. Physical boundaries. Professional boundaries. Property boundaries. The trouble starts when somebody decides their convenience matters more than everyone else's rights. Looking back now, the loading dock is still there. The same warehouse. The same yellow paint. The same signs. Nothing about the property changed. The only thing that changed was what happened when those signs were ignored. And that's what makes this story interesting to me. Some people still think I overreacted. A few locals argued that towing was too harsh. Others said I should have continued giving warnings. Maybe they're right. Maybe there was another solution I never found. But I always come back to one simple fact. I tried warnings. I tried conversations. I tried patience. None of it worked. The problem only disappeared when ignoring the rules became more expensive than following them. So now I'm curious what you think. If someone repeatedly used your private property because it was convenient for them, would you have done the same thing? Were the towing fees a fair consequence, or was I too strict? Let me know down in the comments, because even now, years later, people in town still argue about who was right and who was wrong. And honestly, I have a feeling this debate isn't ending anytime soon.